Today, on Anzac Day 2022, we commemorate 100 years since the Ithaca War Memorial was inaugurated by the then Governor of Queensland, Sir Matthew Nathan. On February the 25th, 1922, only a short walk from the precincts of this church, the Ithaca community gathered to pay their respects to the fallen soldiers from World War I. Since 1922, the Boys Brigade have marched every year to the Anzac Day service held at the memorial as they did today, to pay their respects to those who have fallen from their community. Of the 128 men named on the Ithaca War Memorial, 13 were members of the congregation here at Ithaca Presbyterian Church. Another 3, whose names do not appear on the memorial and are yet recorded on the honour roll in this church, also gave their lives in the Great War between 1914 and 1918. Remarkably, 7 of those men were Scottish-born, with 3, John Hay, one of the youngest, James Nichol, one of the oldest, and Sidney Mitchell, all hailing from Bonnie Dundee, Scotland. They were a skilled cohort as well, amongst them 7 tradesmen, 2 teachers, 2 clerks, and a draper's assistant. Their average age at the time of giving their lives was 26 and a half, the youngest being Kenneth Munro, a clerk from Glanmire Street, Paddington, who fell at Bullecourt in 1917, aged 20. The eldest, 2 venerable warriors in the persons of George Minto and James Nichol, both Scottish-born and privates in the 25th Battalion, who fell in the Battle of the Menin Road, Belgium, in September 1917. They were both aged 43. Nichol had already served 10 years and had a stint in the Boer War in one of his homeland's proudest regiments, the Black Watch. The 25th Battalion was in fact home to at least 8 of the Ithaca congregation at one stage or another during the First World War. 4 of these men served in the 9th Battalion, the formation that was first ashore at Gallipoli and first into action at Pozières. It was at Pozières and Mouquet Farm during the 1916 Somme offensive that the AIF suffered 23,000 casualties in 8 weeks. These included the 9th Battalion's John Campbell, tram conductor of Arthur Terrace, the 47th Battalion's John Cassidy, carpenter of Rockbourne Terrace, the 25th Battalion's Donald Doole, plumber of Collingwood Street, and the 15th Battalion's Sidney Mitchell, carpenter of Guthrie Street. The ferocity of the fighting at Pozières was such that anyone who was afforded burial would be disturbed time and again by the heaviest artillery bombardment that Australians experienced during the war. As such, these 4 soldiers have no known grave, and their names are recorded at the Villa Bretonneau Memorial. Also denied a grave is Francis Chalmers, another Scottish-born carpenter of Alice Street, Paddington, who was wounded at Pozières with the 9th Battalion but survived, only to disappear in the mud of Passchendaele after falling on the 3rd of November 1917. His name is recorded on the Menin Gate at Ypres. In fact, the 10 men from this congregation who made the supreme sacrifice did so on the Western Front. Unlike Ulysses in Greek mythology, they never regained their home in Ithaca. These are their stories.
James, Cecil and Thomas Aitken. James Aitken was born in Brisbane in 1893. He was the son of James and Clara Aitken of Dorset Street, Ashgrove. He was living and working in Sydney as a clerk at the time of his enlistment in February 1916 and was destined to train for 6 months in Australia before sailing for overseas in August that year with reinforcements for the 18th Battalion, a New South Wales unit. James missed the bloodbath that consumed the AIF at Pozières, but not the bitter winter on the Somme that followed, the worst, it was said, for 50 years. While occupying the winter line near Fleur, Private Aitken received gunshot wounds in the back during a whole-of-battalion action to assault the German positions in Malt Trench, opposite the 18th Battalion, on the 26th of February 1917. In what would have been a Herculean task in the mud, James' comrades evacuated him to the rear, where he died in a casualty clearing station at a village that was to become famous in Australian military history. A little over a year later, James' brothers Cecil Crawford Aitken and Thomas Edward Aitken were serving in the 49th Battalion, a Queensland unit, and engaged in an epic defence of the same French village where their brother lay. That day, on the 5th of April 1918, 3 Australian battalions fought off 3 German divisions at a place called Dernancourt. Cecil was wounded and shipped to the UK for treatment. Both he and Thomas survived the war and returned to Australia in 1919. James, Cecil and Thomas's parents were to rename their house at Ashgrove Dernancourt, after that very village where Cecil and Thomas fought in defence of the old Amiens line and their brother's grave. James lies there today with the epitaph, "Until the day breaks and the shadows flee away."
John Hoggan Campbell. John Campbell was born in Aberfoyle, Scotland in 1889. After his father seemingly absconded, young John was raised by his mother, Elizabeth, and his stepfather, John, from the age of 2, taking the latter's surname. The family migrated to Australia, and by the time of his enlistment in October 1915 at Fraser's Hill, now the Gallipoli Barracks at Enoggera, John was working as a tram conductor, an occupation synonymous with the Ithaca area, giving his address as Arthur Terrace, Red Hill. He'd had some training as a cadet and in the Citizens Military Forces, CMF, prior to the war, but nothing would prepare him or anyone else for war on the industrial scale of the Western Front. John was allocated to D Company, 9th Battalion, which was tasked to assault in the second wave of the attack on Pozières village on the 23rd of July 1916. The objectives were gained, but John was killed in action and his grave lost in the 8-week campaign. His mother experienced some struggles with officialdom, it appears. It was customary in those times to obtain your lost one's personal effects and war medals. As his mother, she could not be deemed next of kin unless proper inquiries had been made to establish that his absent father could not be found. That involved advertising in newspapers and waiting to see if there was a response. In the end, Elizabeth was the only applicant for her son's effects, and together with John's campaign medals, they were duly sent to Arthur Terrace. Private John Campbell is memorialised on the Villa Bretonneux Memorial in France.
John Cassidy. John Cassidy had much in common with his fellow volunteers from the Ithaca Presbyterian Church. By the time he enlisted at age 21 and a half in September 1915, giving his occupation as carpenter, enough was known about how the Gallipoli campaign was going for the early patriotic fervour to have abated somewhat. Duty called nevertheless. Little did the new volunteers know that greater tests were to come. John Cassidy and 3 other men from the parish would meet that test at Pozières and make the supreme sacrifice. Private Cassidy was serving with the 47th Battalion when he fell on the 10th of August 1916 as the Australian attack pivoted towards Mouquet Farm. He was reported to be buried 500 yards northeast of Pozières, but the fighting obliterated all trace of his grave. Like Privates Campbell, Doole and Mitchell, his name was inscribed on the Villa Bretonneux Memorial, but not until 1938, when the edifice was finally completed. For John's parents, like many others, the absence of a grave was the source of enormous sorrow for many years. As late as 1922, the Army was still responding to letters from the Cassidy home on Rockbourne Terrace. John Cassidy Sr. had furnished an inscription for his son's headstone, but without a grave it was for naught. Major Lean of Base Records wrote on the 15th of February 1922 that the surface of the whole battlefield area has been searched 6 times, and in some places 20 times since the armistice. But it is possible that bodies will continue to be found for years as the work of reconstruction continues. Private John Cassidy's grave was never found. His forgotten epitaph reads, "We do not forget thee. We love thee too dearly for your memory to fade from our lives like a dream."
Walter William Erickson. Walter Erickson's name does not appear on the Ithaca Memorial. Perhaps due in part to the fact that his parents moved to Sheridan Street, Cairns, sometime during or after the war, and may not have been aware of the public subscriptions to erect a memorial to the local fallen of Ithaca. Nevertheless, they and Walter's sister Clara had all lived in Glenrosa Road, Red Hill, which was left as his forwarding address on his enlistment in Brisbane on the 9th of July 1915 at age 23. Young Erickson had travelled around during his short life. He was born in Cowra, New South Wales in 1892 and finished his secondary education at Maryborough Grammar School, serving 2 years in the school cadets. He went on to Teachers College himself and by war's outbreak was a master at Wallarai Grammar School, Orange, New South Wales. He served in A Company, 31st Battalion, along with a number of other men on the Ithaca War Memorial, Arthur Bridge, Patrick Kelly and James McCormack, which deepens the mystery as to why his name is absent from the memorial. That the 4 survived Fromelles, said to be the bloodiest 24 hours in Australia's history, is remarkable, the more so for Erickson being a sergeant and therefore in the vanguard of the attack on the 19th to 20th of July 1916. However, Sergeant Erickson was on shortened time. He was killed in a trench raid by 5 officers and 100 men in the Hoop Lines sector on the 12th of October 1916 on a feature called the Chicken Run. The Adjutant Major Eckersley wrote in the battalion war diary, "Very successful raid, 3 prisoners, 1 MG taken." There was no word in his report of casualties. Walter Erickson was laid to rest in the town of Armentières, made famous by the wartime song In City Bonjon Cemetery. His epitaph reads, "He died as he lived for others."
George and Robert Minto and James Nichol. George Minto was born in Carstairs, Scotland in 1874 and was a blacksmith by trade. He and his wife Agnes lived in School Street just off Kennedy Terrace. At the time of his enlistment, on the 31st of October 1916, he was aged 42 years and 8 months. His eldest son Robert, an employee of the Postmaster General, had beaten his father to the recruitment office. Robert's first attempt to enlist came in February 1916, before his 18th birthday and without his parents' consent. It was 22 days before the ruse was discovered and Robert was discharged, only to successfully re-enlist in August 1916 after he achieved his majority. It is open to speculation that George's enlistment may have been driven by a desire to keep an eye on the boy. What is a fact is that the father enlisted 2 months after his son, on the 31st of October 1916, at the same time as Blackwatch veteran James Nichol, with whom George had served in the military police in Brisbane prior to enlistment in the AIF. The 3 sailed for Europe together on the Demosthenes from Sydney on the 23rd of December 1916 as reinforcements for the 25th Battalion. Some training ensued in the UK, with George and James reaching the 25th Battalion at the front in July 1917. By the time Robert had joined the battalion on the 24th of October 1917, both his father and James Nichol were dead, wounded on the opening day of the Battle of the Menin Road on the 20th. George succumbed to his wounds on the 23rd and James on the 24th. George Minto is buried at 9 Elms Cemetery near Ypres, Belgium. Agnes, his wife, chose the following epitaph: "In memory of our beloved husband and father." James Nichol's wife, Jean, of Wolseley Street, Paddington, chose a similar sentiment for his grave at Lissentook: "In memory of my loved husband and our father." Roberts returned to Australia in 1919. He served his country again during the Second World War when he enlisted, like his father, at the age of 42, to serve out his time on the home front as a sapper in the 2nd Division Signals. He was honourably discharged in 1945.
These are just a few of the stories that this honour board at the Ithaca Presbyterian Church holds. It is important to remember the dead, but also those who returned to play their role in rebuilding a broken community. We are grateful for all their sacrifices, lest we forget.